That white leisure suit, that disco stage, that forced grin. If there is one show that defines how badly the 70s wanted to look cool and just didn't, it is the Brady Bunch Variety Hour. Even the cast winced. Even ABC barely promoted it. It is the gold standard of secondhand embarrassment. But it was not alone. The 1970s were packed with variety shows trying to chase youth culture, disco, glitter, and relevance. Some bombed instantly. Others pulled ratings but got roasted by critics. Let us count down the cringiest experiments that tried to be hip and landed somewhere between awkward and catastrophic. Number 12. The Bobby Goldsboro Show, 1973 to 1976. Here is the thing. This one was not a ratings disaster. In syndication, it actually held steady in many markets. But culturally, it felt like your uncle trying to use teenage slang. Bobby Goldsboro was already known for sentimental ballads like Honey, soft, emotional, safe. So producers tried to pivot him into a youth-oriented variety host at the exact moment glam rock and hard-edged pop were taking over. The result was a strange tonal mismatch. Glitter costumes appeared. Up-tempo dance numbers tried to look current. Comedy sketches aimed at teens. But everything was wrapped in a layer of squeaky clean wholesomeness that felt about 5 years behind the culture. The show leaned heavily on musical guests and light comedy bits. There were elaborate stage setups, choreographed dancers, and colorful lighting clearly inspired by the variety giants of the time. But the energy rarely matched the ambition. Now, when you compare it to what was happening in real youth culture, David Bowie redefining rock theatrics, disco clubs transforming nightlife, this show looked like it was playing dress-up. Critics often described it as safe to the point of blandness. It was not aggressively bad. It was awkward. It tried to be contemporary without actually understanding the edge that made 70s pop culture exciting. The comedy sketches were often stiff. The musical transitions felt over-rehearsed. There was a visible effort to appear hip, but no actual risk. So, was it a bomb? Not technically. It survived 3 years in syndication, which is respectable. But creatively, it was mocked for being square in a decade that punished anything that smelled even slightly square. That is the 70s paradox. You could have ratings and still feel out of touch. And the Bobby Goldsboro Show became a symbol of that exact disconnect, a variety show trying to wink at youth culture while still asking it to sit nicely on the couch. Number 11. The Melba Moore-Clifton Davis Show, 1972. Now this one? This was a real ratings casualty. CBS launched the Melba Moore-Clifton Davis Show in 1972 with serious ambition. Melba Moore had Broadway credibility. Clifton Davis had charisma and writing chops. On paper, this could have been a fresh, urban, contemporary variety program that blended soul, theater polish, and modern comedy. Instead, it lasted only 1 season. The issue was identity. The show tried to merge Broadway sophistication with network-friendly variety formatting. Big musical numbers, polished staging, guest stars, comedy sketches. But it never quite found its tone. Was it edgy? Not really. Was it traditional? Not exactly. It floated in a middle space that felt uncertain. The early 70s were shifting fast. Soul music was evolving. Television audiences were fragmenting. Norman Lear was redefining sitcom realism. Against that backdrop, this show felt like it was chasing cool without fully committing to it. Critics pointed out that the comedy segments often felt forced. The pacing dragged. The musical performances were strong individually, but the connective tissue between segments felt mechanical. There was visible effort, impressive sets, high production value, but it lacked the spark that made variety hits like The Carol Burnett Show feel alive. Ratings declined quickly. CBS pulled the plug after 1 season. That makes it one of the true bombs on this list. And here is what makes it especially painful. The talent involved was real. Melba Moore could command a stage. Clifton Davis had legitimate creative instincts. But the format boxed them in. Instead of redefining variety for a new generation, the show ended up looking like a glossy imitation of what had already worked in the late 60s. That is the theme of this countdown. Not incompetence, not laziness, but desperation to look relevant. And when television smells desperate, audiences feel it instantly. Next, we get into the shows that were not just awkward. They were legendary cringe. Number 10, The Jim Stafford Show, 1975 to 1976. This one sits in that strange middle space between harmless and painfully awkward. Jim Stafford was a novelty country singer. Spiders and snakes. My girl Bill. He had charm. He had a goofy smile. What he did not have was the kind of edge that the mid-70s suddenly demanded. ABC gave him a prime-time variety platform in 1975. On paper, it made sense. He could sing, he could tell jokes, he could carry a stage. But the format was glossy network variety, at a moment when audiences were drifting toward grittier realism and sharper comedy. The show mixed country-flavored musical numbers with scripted sketches. There were recurring characters, broad slapstick bits, studio audiences laughing on cue. The problem was not that it was offensive, it was that it felt like it was trying very hard to convince viewers it was hip, while still playing it completely safe. You would see disco lighting behind a country novelty song. You would get fast-paced costume changes that screamed, "We are modern." But the humor often landed with a thud. For the sketches leaned heavily on exaggerated accents and obvious punchlines. It felt like something engineered by committee rather than driven by personality. Ratings started decently, but slid quickly. By its second season, ABC was done. That makes this one closer to a ratings disappointment than just a critical punching bag. The real issue was timing. In 1975, the culture was splintering. Saturday Night Live debuted that same year and redefined what television comedy could look like. Against that backdrop, The Jim Stafford Show felt like a relic that did not realize it was already outdated, and that is why it lands here. Not a total disaster. Not universally hated. But a glossy attempt to look current that instead revealed how fast the decade was moving past traditional variety formulas. Or number 9, The Hudson Brothers Razzle Dazzle Show, 1974 to 1975. This one went bigger, louder, weirder, and somehow even more uneven. The Hudson Brothers were marketed as teen heartthrobs with a rock band edge. CBS tried to turn that energy into a Saturday morning variety hybrid. Music, sketch comedy, slapstick chaos, wild costumes, bright colors everywhere. It looked like someone poured sugar into a television studio and hit record. And to be fair, it had energy. Real energy. The brothers committed fully. The physical comedy was frantic, the musical numbers were loud and fast, but the writing often felt thrown together. Sketches would start strong and collapse into noise. Jokes leaned on repetition instead of structure. The attempt to appear cool was obvious. There were psychedelic backdrops, hyperactive editing, and youth slang sprinkled through scripts. But cool cannot be manufactured by turning the volume up. It has to feel natural. Critics were harsh. They described it as chaotic and thin. Parents sometimes found it grating. Kids were divided. Some loved the madness. Others tuned out. Ratings were not catastrophic at first. It lasted 2 seasons in various formats. But it never became the breakout youth sensation CBS clearly hoped for. In that sense, it was not an immediate bomb, but it was a strategic failure. It did not create a lasting franchise. It did not define a generation. Instead, it became a snapshot of the mid-70s variety scramble. Networks saw youth culture exploding and thought faster and louder would equal cooler. It did not. What remains is a show remembered more for its frantic awkwardness than its impact. High energy, but high ambition, low staying power. Number 8, The Captain and Tennille Show, 1976 to 1977. On paper, this should have worked. Captain and Tennille were chart-topping soft rock stars. Love Will Keep Us Together was everywhere. They had wholesome appeal, built-in audience, network support. ABC handed them a glossy variety hour in 1976, with big sets and bigger expectations. Here is the uncomfortable truth. It felt forced from the first episode. The show leaned hard into comedy sketches. That was the mistake. Tony Tenniel could sing, Daryl Dragon could arrange and perform, but neither was a natural sketch comedian. The scripts tried to frame them as playful and quirky. Instead, it often felt like watching musicians politely survive material that was not written for them. There were elaborate costumes, over-the-top stage lighting, with celebrity guests trying to lift the energy. The production design screamed prime-time event. But underneath all that polish was a tone problem. The show wanted to feel contemporary and hip. Disco was rising. Variety was evolving. Yet the comedy felt soft and safe and slightly stiff. Critics noticed. Reviews described it as overly cute, too calculated, lacking spontaneity. The word bland appeared more than once in press coverage. Ratings were decent at first thanks to the duo's music popularity, but the momentum did not hold. By 1977, it was gone. That makes it more than just critically mocked. It was a short-lived experiment that did not justify its budget or hype. The lasting image is not of a musical triumph. It is of two talented performers trapped inside a format that exposed their weaknesses. Variety shows demand looseness, improvisation, a sense that anything could happen. This felt scripted down to the last wink. It was not a catastrophe like what is coming later, but it was a glossy reminder that chart success does not automatically translate into television cool. Number 7. The Red Fox Show, 1977 to 1978. Now this one had serious expectations behind it. Red Fox was already a television icon thanks to Sanford and Son. That show had grit, timing, sharp edges. When ABC launched The Red Fox Show in 1977, the network wanted to capitalize on that success with a more polished variety-driven format. The problem was polish. Fox thrived in raw environments, stand-up clubs, sitcom tension, quick, sharp dialogue. The new show tried to wrap him in big musical numbers and glossy stage presentation. It softened the edges that made him magnetic. There were sketches, celebrity cameos, musical interludes, but the tone drifted. Sometimes it felt like a standard variety hour. Other times it tried to recreate the sharp humor audiences expected. The result was inconsistency. Critics argued that Fox looked constrained. The writing did not always match his rhythm. Moments that should have felt spontaneous felt rehearsed. That is deadly in variety television. Ratings tell the real story. The show struggled almost immediately. It lasted only one season before cancellation. That makes it a legitimate ratings bomb, rather than simply a critical disappointment. And here is the irony. The talent was undeniable. The audience knew his voice. They trusted his humor. But instead of letting him dominate with that authenticity, the format diluted it. The show tried to be broader, shinier, safer. In doing so, it stripped away the very thing that made Red Fox compelling. It stands as a cautionary tale. When you sand down an artist to fit a variety template, you risk sanding away the spark itself. Number 6. Pink Lady and Jeff, 1980. Yes, it technically aired in 1980. But make no mistake, this is pure late 70s variety excess. Disco glitter still clinging to the curtains. Studio executives still convinced that louder equals cooler. NBC had what they thought was a genius idea. Import Japanese pop sensation Pink Lady. Pair them with American comedian Jeff Altman. Build a cross-cultural variety show that captures the global youth moment. Big music, big choreography, big laughs. It lasted 6 episodes. Here is why. Pink Lady were huge stars in Japan, polished, synchronized, high energy, but they spoke very little English. Or the show was written entirely in English. That meant cue cards, memorized phonetic lines, awkward pauses. You could feel the strain in real time. Jeff Altman was a capable comic, but the tone never matched. Sketches would start with forced banter that felt like two completely different shows stitched together. Then a musical number would hit with full disco power. Then back to stiff dialogue. The disconnect was constant. Critics were brutal. They described it as baffling, confusing, painful to watch. One review famously questioned how so much money could produce so little cohesion. The production was not cheap. The sets were glossy. The costumes were wild. But none of it mattered because the core interaction felt unnatural. Ratings were catastrophic. The premiere struggled. The drop-off was immediate. NBC pulled the plug after 6 episodes. That is not a slow decline. That is a crash. And yet what makes it unforgettable is not just the failure. It is the visible effort to be cool. The disco lighting, the neon stage, the exaggerated choreography. Everything screamed modern and international. But instead of feeling cutting edge, it felt like a corporate attempt to reverse engineer youth culture. There were moments of genuine musical talent. Pink Lady could perform. When they were singing in their comfort zone, the energy spiked. But the format boxed them into awkward English comedy beats that drained that spark instantly. Today, the show has cult status. Not because it was misunderstood genius, but because it represents peak variety overconfidence. The belief that star power and production gloss could substitute for chemistry. It could not. Pink Lady and Jeff is not just cringy, it is legendary cringe. A 6-episode monument to how badly networks misread the moment at the end of the 70s. And somehow the show that ranks even higher managed to embarrass itself with a far more familiar cast. Number 5. The Brady Bunch Variety Hour, 1976 to 1977. This was supposed to be a triumphant reunion. The Brady kids were recognizable faces, safe, familiar, beloved by families. ABC looked at the disco explosion and thought, why not put the Bradys on a glittering stage with choreographed dancers and comedy sketches? That sentence alone tells you everything. The concept was simple on paper. The Brady family wins a variety show contract. They perform weekly musical numbers. Celebrity guests appear. Comedy bits fill the gaps. It would combine nostalgia with 70s flash. Instead, it created one of the most uncomfortable artifacts of the decade. The biggest issue was tone. The original Brady Bunch sitcom was gentle and sincere. The Variety Hour demanded exaggerated performance and self-aware glitz. Suddenly, these suburban kids were wearing sequins, performing disco routines, delivering punchlines that felt completely out of character. Even behind the scenes, there was tension. Several cast members have openly admitted they did not want to do it. Some participated reluctantly. Others described it as creatively misguided from the start. The production was not cheap. The sets were enormous. The costumes were flashy. Guest stars rotated through to try to boost appeal. But no amount of spectacle could hide the mismatch between the wholesome brand and the desperate attempt to look trendy. Critics were merciless, so reviews described it as awkward, forced, overproduced. The word embarrassing surfaced repeatedly in commentary. Ratings were inconsistent. The premiere pulled curiosity numbers because people wanted to see the reunion. But retention slipped. It lasted only 1 season before cancellation. That makes it both critically mocked and commercially short-lived. What makes it linger in pop culture memory is how visible the strain is. You can see performers trying to commit to choreography that does not fit them. You can feel jokes landing in silence. You can sense the network pushing glitter onto a format that was never built for glitter. It was not edgy. It was not dangerous. It was simply a clear case of executives misunderstanding why audiences loved something in the first place. The Bradys worked because they were sincere. Or the Variety Hour asked them to wink at the camera while wearing disco boots, and that is how you turn comfort into cringe. Now we move closer to the top, and the next entries either survived despite ridicule or crashed even harder than this one. Number 4. The Donnie and Marie Show, 1976 to 1979. This one is tricky, because by numbers alone it does not belong on a failure list. It pulled strong ratings, it ran 3 seasons, it became a cultural fixture. But culturally, it was relentlessly mocked. Donnie and Marie Osmond were marketed as wholesome teen idols trying to straddle bubblegum pop and disco-era cool. The problem was that by the mid-70s, youth culture was splintering fast. Punk was emerging. Disco clubs were redefining nightlife. Rock theatrics were getting darker and bolder. As against that backdrop, this show felt aggressively squeaky clean. Every episode leaned into elaborate costumes and themed musical medleys, big dance numbers, glittering sets, guest stars from across the entertainment spectrum. On the surface, it looked like primetime spectacle. But here is where the discomfort creeps in. The comedy sketches often felt painfully scripted. Broad jokes, obvious punchlines, forced sibling banter that sometimes felt more rehearsed than spontaneous. The show tried to wink at trends without actually participating in them. Disco lighting would flood the stage, but the energy remained controlled and safe. Critics were divided. Some praised the production polish. Others described it as saccharine and out of touch. Reviews frequently pointed out that it seemed engineered for families who wanted youth culture without any of its rough edges. And audiences showed up. That is the paradox. It thrived in ratings while simultaneously becoming shorthand for square variety excess. To some viewers, it was comforting. To others, it was proof that network television did not understand where the culture was heading. It was not a ratings bomb, not even close. But creatively, it became emblematic of a format trying too hard to stay relevant by layering glitter over a fundamentally conservative tone. Today, it is remembered with a mix of nostalgia and irony. The costumes, the synchronized dance routines, the relentlessly upbeat energy. It all feels like a time capsule of a moment when variety television tried to convince itself it was still the center of youth culture. And maybe that is why it belongs this high on the list. Because success does not automatically equal cool. Sometimes it just means enough people were willing to play along. The next entry had far less patience from audiences, and far less time to recover. Number 3. The Sonny and Cher Comedy Hour, 1971 to 1974. At the beginning, this show was sharp, funny, stylish. It revived Sonny and Cher's careers and proved that variety television could still feel contemporary in the early 70s. Cher especially commanded the screen. The Bob Mackie gowns, the dry delivery, the chemistry between the two leads. It worked. But here is where the cringe crept in. As seasons progressed, the format hardened into repetition. The banter between Sonny and Cher became predictable, for the sketches leaned into exaggerated character bits that felt less spontaneous and more mechanical. The wink at youth culture started to feel like a routine instead of a reflection of what was actually happening outside the studio. The show still pulled ratings. It was not a bomb. In fact, it ranked high during parts of its run. But critics increasingly described it as formula-driven, safe, dependent on catchphrases and costume spectacle. And then there was the cultural shift. By the mid-70s, the counterculture energy that once made Sonny and Cher feel fresh had evolved. Comedy was changing. Music was changing. Audiences were beginning to expect sharper satire and more risk. Compared to that, the Sonny and Cher Comedy Hour started to feel polished to the point of stiffness. The costumes grew more elaborate, the musical numbers bigger. But the emotional authenticity that fueled its early success felt diluted. It became a show performing itself. After their divorce, the format struggled to maintain momentum in spin-offs. The magic was clearly tied to the original dynamic. Without it, the structure looked exposed. So was it a failure? Not commercially. It ran multiple seasons and remains iconic. But creatively, it became a case study in how quickly cool can calcify. What starts as playful and stylish can harden into something that feels rehearsed and slightly desperate to maintain relevance. It did not collapse overnight. It faded into its own formula. And that slow slide into predictability is sometimes more uncomfortable than a spectacular crash. Now we move into the top 2. And these final entries did not just feel awkward. They felt like television scrambling to survive a format that was already losing its grip on the culture. Number 2. The Croft Super Show, 1976 to 1978. Sid and Marty Krofft had already built a reputation for psychedelic children's television. Bright colors, strange costumes, surreal characters. That style worked in the late 60s and early 70s when Saturday morning TV could still feel experimental. By 1976, they tried to level it up. The Krofft Super Show mashed together live-action superheroes, musical bits, comedy sketches, and wild visual effects. There were capes, rubber monsters, glitter backdrops, over-the-top villains delivering theatrical lines like they were in a comic book fever dream. The intention was obvious. Make it louder, make it flashier, capture that comic book energy before comic book culture was mainstream. Unpackage it as youth-driven excitement. But here is the uncomfortable reality. By the mid to late 70s, kids' television was shifting. Audiences were becoming more cynical. Effects that once felt imaginative now looked cheap. Dialogue that once felt playful now sounded forced. The Krofft style began to look dated almost in real time. The show was not an immediate ratings bomb. It ran for 2 seasons in different formats, but it never broke through as a defining hit. It existed. It filled a slot. It did not dominate. Critics were split. Some appreciated the ambition. Others found it chaotic and tonally uneven. The sketches could feel disconnected from the superhero segments. The pacing sometimes lurched between frenetic and sluggish. And then there is the aesthetic. Heavy makeup, foam costumes, exaggerated acting. It was a style that demanded total commitment from the audience. By 1977, that commitment was thinning. The cringe factor comes from watching a production throw every visual trick at the screen in an effort to look cool. Psychedelic patterns, high-pitched catchphrases, hyperactive editing. It feels like television trying to convince you it is exciting instead of simply being exciting. It was not the worst ratings failure of the era, but it became emblematic of a format straining to compete with a culture that was moving toward sharper comedy and slicker action. And now we reach number 1. The show that represents not just an awkward moment, not just a failed experiment, but the final gasp of a variety model that believed glitter and volume could substitute for authenticity. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Once number 1. The Barbara Mandrell and the Mandrell Sisters, 1980 to 1982. Yes, it premiered in 1980. But spiritually, this is pure late 70s variety excess. Big hair, bigger shoulder pads, huge mirrored stages. It is the sound of a format trying to prove it still mattered. Barbara Mandrell was a legitimate country music powerhouse, talented, charismatic, award-winning. NBC saw crossover potential and built a glossy weekly variety hour around her and her sisters. The idea was simple. Country music meets primetime spectacle. Add comedy sketches. Add celebrity guests. Add enough glitter to light up the studio. For a moment it worked. The premiere drew massive ratings. Curiosity was high. Viewers tuned in to see how country charm would mesh with network flash. But momentum tells the real story. The show leaned heavily into elaborate musical numbers. Barbara's musicianship was real. She could switch instruments mid-performance and command the stage. Those segments often soared. The problem was everything in between. The comedy sketches felt painfully forced. Broad setups, obvious punchlines, situational bits that felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. The sisters were charming but not natural sketch performers. Dialogue sometimes landed with polite applause instead of laughter. Critics were divided at first but grew sharper as the seasons progressed. Reviews described it as flashy but hollow, expensive but strained. It felt like an attempt to glue Nashville polish onto a variety template that was already fading. Ratings slipped after the strong debut season. NBC kept it alive for 3 seasons, but by 1982, it was gone. Not a 6-episode implosion like Pink Lady and Jeff. Not a 1-season crash like The Red Fox Show. But a steady decline that reflected audience fatigue. What makes it number 1 is symbolism. By the early 80s, MTV was around the corner. Sketch comedy was evolving. Audiences were fragmenting. The traditional variety hour with its costume changes and scripted banter was losing cultural oxygen. And yet here was this massive glossy production still trying to convince viewers that bigger sets and louder medleys equaled relevance. It did not. The Barbara Mandrell and the Mandrell Sisters stands as the grand finale of the 70s variety mindset. Talented performers, enormous production budgets, earnest effort. But you can feel the era slipping away in real time. That is why it takes the top spot. Not because it was talentless. Not because it was the lowest rated. But because it represents the moment the format tried hardest to look cool and accidentally proved it was not anymore. And that is the story of the 70s variety scramble. Glitter everywhere. Confidence on the surface. And beneath it all, a quiet panic that the culture had already moved on. The 70s did not run out of talent. They ran out of self-awareness. Variety shows kept getting bigger, louder, shinier, but culture was moving faster than the glitter could keep up. Some of these shows bombed instantly. Others pulled ratings while quietly becoming punchlines. Either way, they reveal the same truth. Cool cannot be manufactured in a studio, and the harder television tried to chase it, the more obvious the chase became.